Picture this. It's the evening of November 12th, 1996. High in the skies above Delhi, India, two huge airliners are speeding right toward each other. One is coming down to land, the other is climbing up after takeoff. Now, both of these planes are talking to the very same air traffic controller, and they've been given a standard safety buffer, 1,000 feet of vertical space between them. They should have just slipped past each other, totally safe, like thousands of planes do every single day. But they didn't. On board those two planes were 349 souls. There were merchants heading to India to do business, laborers flying to Saudi Arabia for work, families, and crew members. In just a few minutes, every single one of those 349 lives would be snuffed out in what was about to become the deadliest mid-air collision in the history of flight. So you have to ask, how is that even possible? I mean, when you have an entire system designed specifically to stop this from happening, when a controller is giving out clear instructions, and when there's a safety margin in place, how on earth do two planes manage to hit each other in the middle of a gigantic open sky? Well, that's the big question, and we're about to unravel it. The story of how this collision, which really should have been impossible, actually happened, well, it's a tough lesson about the complex systems we all depend on for safety and what happens when those systems break down. Yeah, this whole horrific event unfolded over a village called Charki Dadri, setting a terrible record that, believe it or not, still stands today. The crash sent absolute shockwaves through the aviation world, forcing everyone to take a hard look at some really critical and, frankly, overlooked problems. Okay, so before we really dig into what happened on that specific day, it's super important to understand the system itself. I mean, how do tens of thousands of planes fly around every single day without constantly bumping into each other? The answer is something called airways. Just think of them as invisible highways crossing the sky. Planes stick to these specific routes, and you've got air traffic controllers acting like the ultimate traffic cops, managing the flow and making sure every single plane keeps a safe distance from every other one. And one of the simplest but most brilliant rules for keeping everyone safe is what's called vertical separation. It works like this. Generally, on the same airway, planes heading east are given odd altitudes, like, say, 35,000 feet. Planes heading west get the even ones, like 34,000 feet. Right away, that simple rule creates a 1,000-foot buffer, making it pretty much impossible for planes going opposite ways to meet. All right, so keeping that system in mind, let's meet the two aircraft and the 349 people whose trips were about to cross paths in the most catastrophic way you can imagine. So, on one side, you've got Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907. It's an old Soviet-era Ilyushin IL-76, a chartered flight bringing Kazakh merchants to India. And on the other, you have Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a giant Boeing 747, packed mostly with Indian laborers on their way to Saudi Arabia for work. Two totally different planes, two different airlines, their worlds completely separate, up until this very moment. Now here's the critical piece of the puzzle. Both planes were flying on the exact same route. The Kazakh flight was descending to land, and the Saudi flight was climbing out after taking off. So yeah, they were on a direct collision course, but in theory, they were perfectly safe, protected by that 1,000-foot vertical separation. So, what happened in those final critical minutes? Let's walk through the actual radio calls with Delhi Air Traffic Control, all of which were being handled by just one man, a controller named VK Dutta. Okay, at 6:32 p.m., the Saudi 747 takes off. Just 2 minutes later, the Kazakh flight, which is coming in, gets cleared to descend to 15,000 feet. At 6:36, the Saudi jet, still climbing, is cleared to 14,000 feet. See the plan? It's simple. The Saudi plane holds at 14,000 feet, and the Kazakh plane passes 1,000 feet above it. At 6:38, the Saudi crew radios in, "Yep, we're holding at 14,000. Then, at 6:39, the Kazakh crew reports they've reached their altitude of 15,000. On the radio, everything sounds totally normal. With both planes reporting that they were exactly where they should be, controller VK Ditta gave a totally standard traffic warning to the Kazakh crew. He told them, "Hey, there's a 747 dead ahead of you going the other way." He says, "Report if in sight." It was the very last instruction they would ever get. The radio operator on the Kazakh plane just replied, asking how far away the other plane was. Dutta calmly told him they were now just 8 miles apart. The operator acknowledged, and then nothing. Just silence. An absolutely gut-wrenching silence. Less than a minute later, the radio suddenly crackled back to life. It was a frantic call from a U.S. Air Force plane flying nearby. Its crew had just seen a massive, fiery explosion light up the dark sky. So, what on earth went wrong? I mean, with a 1,000-foot buffer and both crews confirming they were at their assigned altitudes, this should never have happened. The investigation that followed uncovered a just devastating chain of mistakes. When all was said and done, the final report put the main blame squarely on the crew of the Kazakhstan Airlines flight. The investigators figured out that the pilot had simply not followed the controller's instructions. He was told to descend to 15,000 feet and then stay there, but instead he just kept on descending, flying his plane right into the path of that oncoming 747. But, it wasn't quite that simple. This one mistake turned deadly because of a bunch of other failures in the system. First off, the Kazakh crew didn't speak English well, so they had a radio operator translating for them. That created delays and a huge potential for mix-ups. And this is a big one. The radar at the Delhi airport back then was ancient. It could show the controller where a plane was, but it couldn't show its altitude. He was basically flying blind, having to trust the pilot's words completely. And this is where it all comes together in the most tragic way. The Kazakh flight was supposed to be at 15,000 feet. The Saudi flight was correctly holding steady at 14,000 feet. But the black box data later showed that when the Kazakh crew said they were at 15,000 feet, they were actually still descending right through it. They smashed into each other at 14,000 feet. A disaster this huge is a brutal but necessary wake-up call. After Charki Dadri, the entire global aviation industry was basically forced to make massive, mandatory changes to make sure a tragedy like this could never, ever happen again. So let's look at how this disaster actually led to a much safer future. 3 huge safety upgrades came directly out of this crash. First, something called TCAS, that's the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, was made mandatory. It's basically a computer on the plane that automatically spots other aircraft and literally tells the pilots climb or descend to avoid a crash. Second, English was reinforced as the official language of the skies, with really strict tests for all international pilots. And third, airports all over the world finally invested in modern radar that shows controllers a plane's position and its altitude in real time. So why does this all matter to you and me? Because these changes weren't just some new rules in a book. The technology and the procedures put in place directly because of the 349 people who died at Charki Dadri are working silently in the background on every single flight you take, keeping our skies, which are more crowded than ever, incredibly safe. And that really leaves us with one final, super important idea. It's always easy to just blame one pilot's mistake, but disasters like this are almost never about just one person's screw-up. They're about a whole chain of failures. Failures in communication, in technology, in procedures. And fixing just one of those broken links can be the difference between a normal day and the world's deadliest mid-air collision.